We're now on my garage floor here, away from the bench and away from the truck, because the fan shroud is too big to fit on the bench, and I'm not going to just throw it on top of the engine. But this is the new shroud that's going to go in. This is Ford part number AL3Z8C607-B. There's also going to be different versions of this depending on the truck, from what I understand. According to my Ford dealership, this is the right one for my truck right here, which is a 2011. I think maybe later ones or different ones use a BL3Z part number. Some of the online websites tell me that my truck would take a BL3Z version of this fan assembly. I think it's the same part number, just with a B at the beginning. But who knows what's true for your truck until you talk to your dealership. So got this one, looks identical to the original one in terms of form, fit, and everything. So this is what's going to go in. It should be a pretty easy process. Just have to bend back that wiring harness up in the engine bay and slip it down in there. So this, along with the radiator, bulky things, they're going to go in not very well on camera. So I'm going to do my best to film this process to show you kind of it going back in and how that works, but we'll see what ends up happening there. Alrighty, so as you saw, we got the fan shroud back in, and now it's time to start putting in hardware. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and fix up my wiring harness. Now, what I'm going to do that is, there's a few places, you can see I labeled this fan shroud harness, where these clips came off or are missing. So I've got these ones that came off that I'm totally fine to reuse. One of these goes down kind of right underneath the fuse box, where the harness actually goes down to the fan connectors themselves goes. One of these is still intact. This one came off of the harness. And then this one right here is right front and center, basically, where the positive battery cable goes over to the battery and runs to the fuse box. So the T-shaped one of these is one of those. Now, these guys right here, I'm able to get relatively easily. And actually, if I walk over well off camera to one of my little storage bins, I have a whole slew of them. So you can get these guys right here super easily and super cheap. They are, I don't know if this is the Ford part number or just the part number I order them by, but it's 99-8256. So if you need some of the tree wire loom connectors, you can see it's not quite identical to the factory one, but it's pretty darn close and they work really well. So I'm going to repair a couple other spots that are just completely missing these with those, and I'm probably going to end up relooming sections of the harness as well. So I'm going to go through and do some wire repair work, not actually wire repair work, but repair of the wiring harness. And we'll go through the reinstallation of the rest of this hardware here. I also have the skid plate hardware and an empty little container there, which is going to go on at the very end. But this is all the stuff that we took off. It's just the fan shroud to the radiator, Loctite, fuse box, probably a little bit of Loctite, and power steering reservoir to the fan shroud, a little bolt stud doohickey there. So I'm going to go ahead and do the wiring repairs, and we're going to cut back over to the truck to do the installation of all of this. Our wiring harness is now repaired and reattached. You can see all of this right here. Some of these were intact, but a lot of the clips further up this way and further down that way that go into the fan shroud or battery box or whatever were just totally destroyed. So I had to retape, re-zip tie, reassemble the wiring harness basically in a lot of ways. So next step, we got to secure this fan shroud and secure everything back in place up here on the top side. And first step in that is getting the fan shroud screws in. There's two of these ears, one on either side, and the fan shroud screws go in like so. I know my hand's blocking the view, but you can see it's in there now. 8mm socket. I'm only going to be able to get that so much by hand since the plastic is slightly kind of warped and misaligned type of deal. So one on either side, and we'll move on to the fuse box screws. All right, so we got the radiator shroud bolts in. Now we got to get the core support, the fuse box bolts into the core support. They're these funky threaded ones because it goes into this composite here. But all we got to do is the same as whenever we removed them. Kind of slide them into place in here without dropping them like I just did that one into the little radiator channel. And get them started. Now these ones I believe were 10mm, but we just gotta get them threaded into place. So Gonna do all 4 of those and then move on to the power steering stud over on the other side. Okay, so I actually had to go back through my video to figure out what was going on with the power steering reservoir. But we have the stud here, and I thought that this threaded just into the radiator fan shroud and that the reservoir went on top. That's not the case. The stud sticks out, but then this just screws down and holds the reservoir in place. So not only is it time to throw that in, but it's time to actually throw the new reservoir in, and we're going to get those lines hooked up as well. So the part number, I don't know if I went over this one earlier in the video, is right here, CL3Z3E764-A, and that is what I'm told by my Ford dealership, the latest part number reservoir that fits this truck. Probably the same on all of them, but I don't know that for a fact because there are a few differences from what I've been told. But pull this guy out of the bag, brand spanking new. It's a good idea to replace these on a somewhat regular basis on these anyway, with the power steering system contaminations and issues that these things have anyway. But that's going to go in just like so, and this is going to mount on the driver's side of the radiator fan shroud. I'll show you that in the engine bay of the truck, but this is ready to go into place. And from here we're going to start putting on hoses and everything. So new reservoir, I've just got loosely kind of held in here. You're not going to be able to see it on camera, but the stud just goes right down in here, and there's a little clip nut in the fan shroud that it threads into. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten that up here on camera real quick. Now the bottom of the reservoir does have a tab that drops into a spot on the fan shroud itself, and I'll show that here in just a second once I get this tightened down. But this is it basically for reservoir install, other than swapping the lines over. Now, as you guys know from watching the video, we've got one new line. Just getting this snugged down. There we go. Nice and tight. And I did put Loctite on that stud too, so that's going to be nice and vibration resistant. So if I move the camera here, you can see the stud down in there. Now I was feeling underneath the wiring harness here, and it actually feels like there used to be a retainer that would clip to this stud to hold it in place. I might figure out something to do for that, but for now I'm just going to have to leave it. It's been like this for a long time, since before I got the truck, so it'll be fine. The tab goes into this little L-shaped protrusion off of the fan shroud there. So the tab on the bottom of the reservoir. And then, like I said, we're ready to swap over the lines now. So if you remember, we have a new line right down here for the small side. That's going to be nice and easy to put on. And then I'm going to go ahead and switch over the large, which I believe is the from reservoir to pump suction line, basically. I'm going to switch that over between the reservoirs because that one I did not order a replacement for. It looks pretty good. It feels like it's in good shape. If it's not, if it starts to look any kind of funkiness or anything like that, then I'll just go ahead and replace that too. But for now, it'll be the same line. And that should be it for the power steering pump. Now, the other side of the power steering lines is going to be up here, but we'll take care of that here after we swap with the lines. But those are just some spring clamps. I'm going to keep the camera and everything out of the way because I'm probably going to drip fluid and hopefully not make a big mess, but probably make a little mess. And then we'll come back whenever I've got those lines moved over. All right, we have things really starting to come back together here. I have the small line attached, large line attached. You can see I cleaned that guy up as well. Put some 303 protectant on it to keep it pliable and nice over time. It's in decent shape still. It's getting a little crusty, but not too bad. So we'll keep it around for now. Still got to put some protectant on that line, but that line is the subject of our next little segment here, and that's connecting this thing together. So this is the line that I replaced. This is the original line right here that goes down to the power steering pump, and this line clamps here, so hard line is held nice in place. This isn't flopping around all over the place in operation. But they switched the clamp type. So this used to be a spring clamp, and actually mine was double clamped. Don't know why, but had a spring clamp and then a worm gear clamp here. Now they've switched to what's called an Oetiker clamp. So it's basically a pinch ear type clamp is what you sometimes hear them called. Very common in German cars, not super common in American stuff or Japanese stuff. This is actually the first time I can remember seeing one on any non-German vehicle, at least from a factory part. And basically the way that we install this, I'll show you the actual process here once I reposition the camera. We take a pair of pliers. You can actually take, you shouldn't really do it, but you can take a set of diagonal cutters. You can take a set of front cutters, which is what I'm going to do because I have a really dull set of front cutters that works well for this purpose. Or you can take an outer clamp tool, which I also have but don't have here with me where the truck is. So we're going to take the set of pliers. Basically, we're going to squeeze in the ears here, and it's going to shrink the clamp down. Now, you can see the amount of gap in that clamp. That's more gap than I would expect to see in a clamp for this type of line. So it does strike me as very odd, and this may end up going a little differently, and we may end up switching this clamp out. But I'm going to give what Ford gave me a try. So I'm going to go ahead and set the camera down on top of the fuse box or something here so you can see what's going on and show you what the process looks like. Okay, so here's the pliers in question. You can see it's just basically a set of front cutters. These ones are dulled down. They're not super sharp at all anymore. They're super old. And the way that this clamping system works, you get these guys on over the clamp and you basically squeeze it all shut. So I'm going to go nice and slowly, but we're going to do this live and on camera. And that may be where I stop. I'm gonna sit down and take another look here. This ballooned a lot more than most of these types of clamps do. I'm used to them staying very flat. So this may be some sort of different style of clamp, although it is still made by the Oetiker brand. So it's just kind of interesting. I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that everything's nice and tight, that I can't move the line or anything. Can't rotate it, or at least can rotate it very minimally. And if that's good, it did actually shrink down, so that's good news. Hopefully that's gonna be good to go. And that's the reinstallation of that, other than putting it back in this clip, which this is a non-factory one, but same thing will apply. Just open it up and clip that line in place. Now we're ready to put on the upper radiator hose. All right, it is upper radiator hose time, and I wanna go over this. This is normally gonna be super simple. It's gonna go on the same way it came off, but if you remember at the very beginning of the video, we had worm gear clamps on, just standard worm gear clamps on. And those are a no-no for radiator hoses, in my opinion, and in a lot of people's opinions. The reason being is because they tighten down, cut into the hose, number one. But the even bigger thing, number two, which was the issue on this truck, is that they don't expand and contract with the rubber and the plastics and everything on heat cycling. So the engine heats up, radiator heats up, hoses heat up, they all expand, and then they contract. The clamps, because they're stainless, expand and contract some, but at a much different rate from the hoses and everything. So basically what you end up with is whenever you get hot, it's probably going to be sealed all right, but whenever things cool down and after things have heat cycled a bunch of times, you're going to have leaks out of those clamps. They also don't provide constant tension around the hose. They have pretty good tension around certain parts, but then they have like a weak point where the actual worm gear side of things is. So what I did, as opposed to those, what I wanted to do was just get factory Ford hose clamps for this. But from what I can find, Ford does not sell those by themselves or with a hose or really in any way, shape, or form. I can't find it in any parts catalog. My dealerships couldn't find it in any parts catalog. So everybody kind of just gave up on that. What I ended up doing is basically the next best thing. I tried to find some of the spring constant tension clamps aftermarket that were kind of like that. I couldn't find any that I was super happy with as far as the quality goes. So I went with some of these Mishimoto constant tension hose clamps. Now these are made for radiator applications. These ones are marked as 32 to 54 millimeters in size. So that's the size range that you're going to need for one of these trucks if you do these. The gold ones are the only available ones at the time because of back orders and shortages and stuff. There's also a stainless version, which 50-50 which one I would rather have. It doesn't really matter too much to me. But these are the only ones available. I'm not trying to put a bunch of bling in my engine bay. But what's nice about these is that they are smooth on the inside, and you can see that band where the teeth are, so it prevents any kind of pinching of the hose. They hold constant tension on the hose a lot better because of that band inside. And the biggest thing is the fact that they have these spring washers up here. Now this is not like a coil spring, it's a bunch of back-to-back spring washers, and what that does is allow the tension being held on the band itself with the screw to adjust with heat cycling. So these hold, as the name implies, constant tension on the radiator hose. Now these still can leak. They're still not the greatest thing in the world, but it's the best solution I have right now. And at some point, if I'm able to find something else, I might replace the upper hose again and throw a better clamp on, especially if Ford ever decides to start selling those, or if I'm able to find them somehow. But if you're interested in using these, it is looks like the part number is mm-clamp-CTWG-54GD. I assume the GD is for the gold version, so maybe try that without that, and that's the stainless one. But I got 2 of these guys, test fit. I don't know how they're going to get clocked, but that's basically how it's going to go on. So we'll go run on over into the engine bay, show you guys the hose going into place, and at that point, other than putting the intake back in, which we're going to do very last, we're ready to fill it up with fluids and actually get it started. So going to fill it up with fluids, power steering fluid, coolant. I don't think I'm forgetting anything there. I am going to do an oil change because I put a new filter on with the oil cooler, but that's going to be off camera. If you want to see a video on that, I have a video on that. And we're pretty darn close to done now. Finally. All right. We have a lot of progress. Upper radiator hose is now in place. You can see the 2 clamps right there and right there. So that guy is set in. It's also clipped into the radiator shroud right where that clamp is. And then we got the power steering reservoir, like we mentioned. Everything's in place there. This is just the mass airflow sensor connector that goes to the intake. You can see I filled that up. I went just a bit above the max line. It's actually settled down a little bit to right about the max line. I'm sure I'm gonna have to top that up because it's gonna suck a bunch of fluid into the system and refill everything that we drained, but that's okay. And then right now, I filled up the entire cooling system all the way to the top using the cooling system funnel that I have, and I'll show that whenever we actually do the bleeding of the system and everything in a little bit, but filled it up as best I could and as high as I could, and now we're pressure testing it. So you can see we're right at the tippy top of that 20 PSI mark. It's been like this for probably 10 minutes or so and holding pressure perfectly. So that's a very, very good sign that everything is nice and sealed and good to go. Obviously heat cycling might expose some leaks, but right now as this sits, we are leak tight and actually airtight, which is great. So other than putting the intake in and buttoning this stuff up and topping up the coolant reservoir, we're pretty much done with the job. What I'm gonna do is let this continue to sit for a while just to make sure everything's good to go. And I'm gonna change the oil in the truck, since I mentioned I have to do that as well. You don't have to do that to replace the cooling system, but since I did the new oil filter and it's time for an oil change for me anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and do it. And we're gonna come back and wrap up the rest of the job. All right, so we have the coolant tank back in now, and we have the line connected here to the water neck. The line routing, I just have coming straight out of the tank, coming kind of along here underneath the fender, and it dips down, comes up and around, and comes up in right there. This transition right here, from here coming down underneath right about at this point, is what I have pictures and video of from previous. I assume that the line was just kind of tucked down in here, but honestly at this point I don't remember. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the air box in and see how all that routing looks. Your routing may vary, especially if you have a stock air box, so this may be entirely different for you. With my aftermarket intake, this is what it is for mine. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the air box in, and we're getting real close to ready to start it up. All right, and we have everything back together. So the one thing I don't have is the battery terminal connected. I did have to reconnect something inside the truck too from another project I was working on. But air box is in, coolant reservoir is in, everything's in place in the engine bay. The lines back here are reconnected, sensors reconnected, wiring harness all nice and routed. Power steering fluid full, transmission was topped up, radiator fluids full. Everything should be good to go. All of our coolers up here. Connections are good in all spots. Should be ready to fire this up. So I'm gonna set this on the corner of my little countertop thing here, right in front of my truck, and get this reconnected, and we'll fire it up and see how she goes. we're finally at the conclusion of this super long and arduous saga, at least for me. Really, this job shouldn't take very long. I mean, you can probably get it done in a weekend, but for me, with all the back orders and everything that happened along the way and all the parts that I found that I wanted to replace or needed to replace, it took a while. I'm into this process, taking my sweet time, a few months. Granted, I'm only working on it a few hours a week, basically, so at most. So, job done. You saw the truck started and ran flawlessly. I ended up doing a lot of bleeding of the cooling system. I actually had the funnel when it was up here. Once the thermostat opened, something to be mindful of. You're gonna have a lot of coolant release and a lot of pressurization changes within the cooling system. Make sure that your funnel, if you're using the type that I was, is pretty darn low. Otherwise, it's gonna possibly overflow. I had that issue and had to clean up my mess all down in here and everything. So that happened, and I had to pull the air filter out because it got into the air box and everything. So not fun, but mistakes were made, and it's worth mentioning so you guys don't make the same mistake if at all possible. But ran the truck a bunch, bled the truck out a bunch. There was still some orange coolant in the system, so hopefully I've gotten most of that out now at this point after all the bleeding and everything and putting in a bunch of new yellow. But I did use new Ford yellow coolant, as you can see in the reservoir. If you have a stock one, you're gonna fill that up to just between the fill lines. This one right here does not have any fill lines on it, so I filled it up to the mold line. If you happen to have this Volant intake, you can do that, and that's about the right level. And I took a look and compared it to my other truck that has a stock coolant tank in it, and that one it's about at the same level, at least below the hose that goes in there. I did do a couple other things. I sleeved this hose here. I don't think I mentioned that yet. Just to protect it from abrasion against really this air box here. The way it runs past that isn't the greatest, and the old hose was a little abraded. I do still need to do a few things to button up my truck. I need to put on the air box lid here, and then if you look in the front here, I don't have the air dams here. I'm gonna be doing a bunch more work on the front of this truck. I have no lights right here or anything. There were some HID ones on here. I'm gonna be putting some more, or some Baja Designs ones on there. So look out for that video if you haven't seen it already, or if you're interested. I'm gonna be doing some headlights. I'm gonna clean up all this wiring. That's some old, not so great wiring that was done for those HID lights. But I'm gonna be doing some cleanup work on the front and bottom line. So I'm not gonna put in these two guys yet. I do have them. They are ready to go. I showed the removal process. The reinstallation is gonna be exactly the reverse. But that's gonna be another time for me. And I wanna wrap this up for all of you guys who are interested in the cooling system process. Like I said, no leaks. Everything looks great. Everything runs great. No coolant stench, no burning coolant smell. I'm probably gonna need to bleed the power steering fluid a little more if you're doing the power steering fluid stuff at the same time, especially if you're doing the lines. I think if you're doing the reservoir, it's one thing, but the lines, that fluid is, it gets very frothy and everything whenever you put it in because there's gonna be a lot of air in the lines. So you're gonna need to take your truck out and bleed it properly. I'm stuck here in my garage right now because I had my other truck behind it. I didn't want to take it out for a drive or anything yet. And just turning the lines around and everything, or sorry, turning the wheels back and forth and everything, bled pretty well, but it didn't completely bleed the lines. There's a tiny bit of whine whenever I hit close to the end of the lock either way. And there's kind of a squishy zone, if you will, at the end of, from lock to lock. So at the very ends of the steering travel. So that's a little bit more air that needs to be bled out. But overall, everything's done, buttoned back up, good to go. Like I said, runs great. Took it up to, while it was idling, and after it warmed up, I took it up to redline and everything a few times. Revs great, runs great, truck seems super happy. Temperature stayed rock solid. In fact, the fans, the electric fans that we installed the new ones up, didn't really even kick on a whole lot while I was sitting here idling in my garage. And granted, the garage is at 75 with the door half open, about 77 degrees or so with the AC. So it stays nice and pretty cool, but I mean, the truck wasn't even having a hard time once it got up to temp, staying at temp. So that's great news. Good new radiator, good solid thing. Didn't screw up any of the AC system, tested all that out. It all still works and blows cold, so that's good. And everything seems to be good to go. One last thing I do want to note that I'm just now noticing, but my other truck is like this too. The gap between into hose and here, we used to have this flush up against here. And I noticed that my other truck has a gap here, and this one does now too. So obviously the higher pressure line here for the power steering must shove itself over and right towards the end here. And this clamp we have clamped down super tight, nice and tight so it doesn't slide off. But just something to keep in mind. That line is probably gonna move on you too if you install this, so don't necessarily be alarmed. Like I said, my other truck's like that and always has been, so not too much of an issue, I don't think. But that's the end of the job. Looks great, runs great. A lot of work, but super happy with how it turned out. So with that, I want to thank you all for watching. If you have any questions on any of what we just did, let me know in the comment section below, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care.